Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Kirk YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. And today's video is titled Luther and the Jews. But in this video, I am addressing the question that often gets posed: is Martin Luther an anti-Semite? Or was Martin Luther anti-Semitic? Did Martin Luther hate the Jews? And a lot of this happens to do with a lot of comments that Luther made about the Jews. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go into everything Luther ever said about the Jews because that would take way too long and we don't have the time for that. Basically, I'm going to give you a bit of information on what Luther said, and to do that, I'm going to go through a paper I wrote called Luther and the Jews, a blot in history, ? Like, is it a blot in history or is it not? Now, what I got here is a really big book. This was an accident. I tried to publish this through Lulu and I accidentally put it through as A4 instead of A5, so it really just blew the whole thing up. I don't actually have it available as a book form anymore because I just didn't think it was worthwhile. I do have a copy of this as a paper, not on the Kirk website, but on my personal website, The Order of Knight George. If you go there and you look up the papers by myself, Pastor Jake Zabel, there should be a copy of it there if you want to read the whole copy for yourself. This paper itself is one that I wrote as part of our Reformation class while I was studying at the Australian Lutheran College, or the Australian Lutheran Seminary, essentially, while I was studying there. And in this paper, again, because Luther says so much about the Jews, he writes about them in so many things, he mentions them in his table talks, he mentions them in this writing, that letter, this sermon. There is so much to go through. I don't have the time to address everything. If you would like a good book on the topic, I would recommend getting Martin Luther, the Bible and the Jewish People, a Reader, edited by Brooke Schramm and Kuris Sterna. I can't say her last name. This book. It's a great book. Recommend getting it. It has, well, basically, goes through all the different texts that Luther ever wrote where he mentions the Jewish people. They seem to have a total of 28 here, and they go through giving a kind of brief explanation of each document and then even some quotes from it. So it's a really good book if you want to get a more in-depth study into Luther's views on the Jewish people. But for this assignment, I decided just to look at the 5 treatises that Luther wrote that kind of directly address the Jewish people. And so this isn't like just 5 random papers he wrote that he happens to mention Jews in. These are 5 that kind of directly address the Jewish people. And so these 5 papers are known as Was Jesus Christ Born a Jew from 1523, Against the Sabbatarians, Letter to a Good Friend, 1538, On the Jews and Their Lies, 1543, On the Infallible Name and on the Lineage of Christ, 1543, and On the Last Words of David, 1543. Now, those are the 5 treatises that I look at in this paper, and so in this paper and this now video, we're going to look at what Luther said, what Luther believed, and just ponder the question, was Luther anti-Semitic? So again, I'm not going to even go through the whole paper here, I'm just going to pick up bits from it, but if you would like to read my paper, go to the Order of Knight George. If you want to have a more in-depth read into Luther's thoughts and comments on the Jewish people by Martin Luther, the Bible and the Jewish People. Good book, I'd recommend it. But basically, we need to go through the 5 different papers and see what Luther thought about the Jewish people. See, Luther wasn't always so negative towards the Jews. Like, the main reason people think Luther was anti-Semitic is because he says a lot of negative things about them. But he wasn't always. The first treatise that Luther wrote regarding the Jewish people is a paper titled That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. And Luther wrote this after Archduke Ferdinand had accused him of preaching a false doctrine in which Joseph was Jesus' biological father and that through him Jesus was born of Abraham's seed. So this Archduke Ferdinand had accused Luther of teaching that Jesus was biologically descended from Joseph. And so Luther wrote this article to defend his teachings on the virgin birth of Jesus. And in this paper, Luther spends time focusing on the Jewishness of Jesus. And he kind of really praises the Jews because Jesus is ethnically a Jew. Like when he talks about like the fact that Jesus is born a Jew, he's not really focusing much on the religious side, but on the actual ethnic side, that Jesus is biologically Jewish. He's ethnically Jewish. He's of the race descended of Abraham. And here, Luther is rather, praiseworthy, kind of nice and positive towards the Jewish people. He does criticize them. Like, the harshest thing Luther would probably say is that he criticizes them for being stiff-necked people, and then he hopes that, like, they would convert to Christianity. But that's really kind of the harsh he kind of gets at them in this paper. In Luther's later 1538, so we jump 15 years later, and Luther writes another paper titled Against the Sabbatarians, Letter to a Good Friend. And this paper is addressed at the Sabbatarians, those who believe that Christians have to keep the Sabbath, as in we need to keep the Sabbath by refraining from all work on Saturday. Like, the Sabbatarians really thought that Christians had to maintain a lot of those old Jewish traditions and rituals, circumcision, kosher, keeping the Sabbath and stuff like that. And so Luther, he's really having a go mostly at the Sabbatarians, but in this paper he takes a shot at the Jews as well. Now, this paper is best viewed not separately to Luther's later work on the Jews and their lives, which came out 5 years later in 1543. Instead, this paper is best viewed as kind of Luther's gateway into his later on the Jews and their lives. See, the most useful line in this entire work is its opening line, where Luther writes, "In the first place, the Jewish people have become very stubborn because of their rabbis. As a result, they are difficult to win over." And so Luther, in these two lines, is mentioning three things that need to be kept in mind when analysing this paper and the next paper. Firstly, Luther, in his earlier statement, he talks about the stubbornness of the Jews not converting to Christianity. And in Luther's earlier paper, that Jesus was born a Jew, he says, "If some of them are so stiff-necked that they won't convert to Christianity, what of it? After all, we ourselves aren't great Christians." In other words, Luther's like, alright, they're stiff-necked, I would like them to convert to Christianity, but if they don't, so what? Leave that to God to sort out. They're not going to get to heaven because they don't believe in Jesus, but just leave them be. That was Luther's original thing. Now in this one, he's like, look, they are difficult to win over, and this is due to their rabbis. And this becomes the second thing that Luther states. He has this growing hatred of the Jews now because they are difficult to win over. Luther's getting frustrated with trying to convert the Jews to Christianity. And this really needs to be put into the historical context of how Luther viewed the Reformation and its relation to the Jewish people. You can see this in Luther's earlier writings. Luther had this naive idea that The only reason people like the Jews and the Muslims weren't Christians is because of the Pope, because of Rome, because the papacy had so corrupted the church that the Catholic Church was such a false church. That's the reason why people weren't converting, because Rome was so heterodox and heretical and the Pope was so terrible that Jews and Muslims didn't want to convert because of the Pope. And so Luther thought, well, once we fix the problem, once we reform the church and we get rid of the Pope and we have a true church, people will just flock to us. And they didn't. And Luther got frustrated by that. He kind of thought that the Jews would just convert. Like, here's the gospel, come and believe it. And they did it. And that frustrated him. And that kind of helps fuel his hatred for the Jews. Which leads us into our third point. Luther declares that his anger is not directed at all the Jews, but at what he calls the stubborn, lying rabbis. So this is something that needs to be remembered when we get into Luther's next paper on the Jews and their lies. That even when Luther is condemning the Jews, when Luther is attacking the Jews, when Luther is calling the Jews names, he doesn't even mean all Jews. He specifically has in mind the leaders and the teachers. And this is something that often gets forgotten. Luther had this statement, you kick the dog, you comfort the child. That's to do with the parable of if you see your dog biting your child, you go and you chase the dog away, you punish the dog, and you go and you comfort and you bandage up the child. Even if the child may have started the fight with the dog, you comfort the child. You comfort the baby and you pull the vicious dog off the child. And that's how Luther viewed the Jewish rabbis, as like these vicious dogs that were leading people astray. And so when Luther is bad-mouthing the Jews, he's not even like bad-mouthing the Jewish laity. He particularly has in his head the Jewish rabbis, the false teachers. It's the same way that Luther would go on about the Pope and the cardinals and the priests. Luther doesn't attack all the Catholic laity. He particularly goes after the false teachers. And so when Luther is attacking the Jews, one thing that needs to be remembered is that even though Luther says the word the Jews, he's particularly thinking of the Jewish teachers. Those who are teaching that Jesus isn't the Messiah, that there isn't such thing as a Trinity, that we're not saved by grace, that Jesus didn't die for our sins. Though that's what Luther has in mind. That's who he's attacking. So that is something that's important to remember, that even when Luther is bad-mouthing the Jews, because we're going to get into some of Luther's foul statements, he goes hard. But keep in mind that he wasn't even attacking Jewish laity. He was particularly focusing on the rabbis. Yeah, he may not have been as careful with his words as he should have been, and made it very specific when he goes, I'm only attacking rabbis. No, Luther wasn't careful in his language. But in his head, he was thinking rabbis. He wasn't thinking all Jews, he was thinking the leaders of the Jewish people. And this is somewhat similar to how, in the Gospel of John, John will often talk about the Jews attacked Jesus and the Jews persecuted Jesus. And what he really means is the scribes and the Pharisees, and particularly the leaders of the Jewish people, those who actually handed Jesus over to Pilate to be put to death. So in a similar way that when John says Jews, he doesn't mean all the Jews, he means the Jewish leaders. So too, when Martin Luther says the Jews, he's often referring to the rabbis, not all the Jewish laity as well. And so that is kept in mind, because we then come into Luther's famous anti-Jewish paper on the Jews and their lies. Now, this book, and I'm not going to go through everything here, this is where Luther really hammers into the Jews about their false teachings and their lies. Now, Luther jumps into some conspiracy theories, and that was spread by a document written at that time by a guy, Anthony Margaritha, who said that Jews were going around killing Christians. and Luther had read this document and believed it to be true. As Luther writes in his paper on the Jews and their lies, he says, "For further information on their devilish practices with such number and words, you may read Anthony Margaritha." So that also needs to be considered in context. Like when Luther's like, hey, these Jews are doing all these wicked things, Luther's referring to that work, which many scholars will debate over whether or not that is true. Luther read it and thought it was true. That is the thing that needs to be kept in mind. So Luther thought that they were doing these things. Though there were other things that Luther does attack the Jews on that aren't necessarily for Margaritha, like just the things that the Jews blaspheme Jesus and the Virgin Mary, that they don't believe in Jesus as a Messiah, and that there were especially Jews that would go around and say things like Mary was just a whore, or that Mary had committed adultery against Joseph and then she lied about the virgin birth. And those things are blasphemous. And as Christians, we consider those things blasphemy. So you can see why Luther would get riled up by people saying that. And there were Jews saying that. So when Luther says, hey, that's what they're saying, that's not even a conspiracy or something made up. That's something they were saying, and Luther's like, how dare they blaspheme Jesus and the Virgin Mary. There's also was the issue of usury, and that's not a conspiracy either. A lot of the Jews did own banks, and they would lend at interest. I mean, banks do that today. They loan out at interest, and that's generally the sin of usury. And Luther really does not like usury. He attacks it in lots of places, not just in regards to Jews, but he makes a point that Christians shouldn't do this. If you're going to give out a loan, do not loan at interest. So Luther's attacking the Jews for doing that, but that's something that still happens today. Banks that aren't even owned by Jews today do lend at interest. If you go and get a bank loan, you will have to pay back interest, and Luther doesn't like that practice, and the Jews were doing that practice, and so Luther attacks them over it. So these are things that were definitely happening. There were other things that were rumors and possibly even just straight out lies that were spread about conspiracies that the Jews were doing, but there were also some things that the Jews were doing that Luther doesn't like, and so he attacks them for it. Now, one thing that most people don't realize is that everybody attacks Luther because of his document on the Jews and their lies. But that's not actually even the worst document Luther ever wrote on the Jews. It's actually very mild when you actually read the document. The document that people really need to look at is on the ineffable name and the lineage of Christ. That is a document where Luther attacks the Kabbalist sorcery that the Jews were doing. Now, this is a lot to go into, but Kabbalist sorcery was at least a medieval practice. I don't know if it's still done today, but it was something that was developed by the rabbinic Jews, in which you could use the name, the holy name of God to do basically witchcraft stuff. And that is something that Jews were doing. That happened. That was at least a medieval practice amongst at least some Jews. And so Luther really goes after them in this document. So this document on the ineffable name and on the lineage of Christ, this is where Luther really goes hard on the Jews, calling them, well, just really bad names like Jewish piss and Judas shit and stuff like that. Children of the devil. Luther goes after them hard in this document. It is so kind of foul, the language Luther uses in this document is so foul and so kind of anti-Jewish that while the document is preserved in the Weimar edition of Luther's works, it has not yet been translated into the American English version of Luther's works. Nobody's bothered to translate it. Even my reading of it comes purely from basically this, because I don't speak German, so these guys had a whole big section about it, and they do have some quotes from it. So my knowledge of that document is based mostly on this book, because it's just not translated in English. If you can speak German, you could probably find it and read it yourself, but I've never read an English version of that document. But it is the document where Luther really goes hard on the Jews. And particularly, again, he is attacking them for this Kabbalic medieval witchcraft practice, which I don't know how widespread this was amongst Jews in Germany, but again, there were some people doing that. There are, some of the Talmudic Jewish stuff does participate in some of this. And so Luther really attacks the Jews hard on this, because essentially it was just a form of witchcraft. And they were using the divine name, the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, to perform basically witchcraft. And so Luther hits them hard on that. Now, what Luther said, again, I don't know everything Luther said, because I can't read the German. But he does call them Jewish piss, Jewish shit, Judas piss. He calls them very foul names. And, that's not appropriate. But you can also see kind of the anger that led Luther to it. Now, does that justify his language? No. But you can see somewhat why he got that mad. And the other thing about Luther is that this is standard Luther. Like, I find it weird that people get shocked about this. Luther wrote a document about something the Jews were doing in the medieval period that he didn't like, and he called them foul names. Yeah, he did the same to the Pope. He did the same to guys like Zwingli and Bucer and the Muslims. Luther was a foul-mouthed guy. He really, he needed to get a hold of his tongue sometimes. And Luther admits that. Like, in Luther's famous Here I Stand speech, he goes through the different writings. He goes, look, my writings are like three kinds. One, those kinds where I have said something that even the Catholics agree with me. I can't renounce those. Two, there's the places where I've attacked people in ways that are unfitting of a man of God. It is unfitting of a pastor or a priest to be speaking like that. And I shouldn't have done that, and I'm sorry. But I can't renounce those either. That's what Luther says. He's like, look, yeah, I admit it. I have done and said things that I'm probably not proud of. I shouldn't have called people those names. It's not fitting of my office as a minister. I won't renounce them because those people were false teachers and they needed attacking, but I do apologize for the foul language I used. And so this is something that Luther is aware of even in himself, that he does have a bit of a fiery temper and that he does have a bit of a foul tongue. And like, it's not just limited to the Jews. Luther said this about the Roman Catholics, he said it about the Muslims, he said it about the Anabaptists, the enthusiasts, the Zwinglians. Luther just attacked everybody that he wasn't in agreement with. He was passionate, and sometimes it led him to say things that he shouldn't have said. But it isn't something limited to just the Jews. And now if we come to Luther's fifth and final document on the last words of David, again, Luther, he talks about the Jews here, but he actually goes rather soft on them. Like, that's something that people forget as well. Like, yeah, Luther went really hard on the Jews in the last three, particularly the third and fourth document. When he gets to this fifth document, Luther kind of goes a lot softer. So Luther, condemns the Jewish commentaries on their interpretations of Moses as like false doctrine. He's like, look, I've read these Jewish commentaries in the Old Testament and they're a load of rubbish. They're full of heresy, they're full of blasphemies, they're full of false doctrine, you shouldn't read them. And that's about as far as Luther goes. And what is interesting here is this statement that Luther makes. He talks about these Jewish commentaries and he says that they speak against the true Jews and against the prophets and the apostles. And so what Luther is getting at there is he goes, look, the faithful Jews, the prophets, the apostles, and, you know, all the believing Jews, those guys were great. And these Jewish commentaries that reject Jesus as the Messiah, they're terrible. And they speak against the true prophets. They speak against the true apostles. They speak against the believing Jews. And therefore they should be rejected and shunned. And so Luther kind of takes a much softer approach in this, like, fifth and final treatise. But again, he's still attacking them. And he's attacking them for not teaching right doctrine. And so all of this needs to be considered when we ask the question, was Luther anti-Semitic? The real answer is no. Luther wasn't anti-Semitic. He wasn't an anti-Semite. And there's a couple things that need to be kept in mind when we are discussing this. One, Luther was a foul mouth. Luther does say things that are inappropriate and shouldn't have been said. Alright, let's start with that fact. That's fact one. They shouldn't have been said. I bet Luther himself may have probably apologized for him if he was, you know, in the right mind and of a calm temper at the day. Like, if he was kind of hot-tempered, he may not apologize, but, like, if you actually sat down and said, look, Luther, you just can't say that. That's very offensive. That's unnecessary. You just can't say that. That's not fitting for a Christian to say, let alone a priest. And Luther would probably say, yes, I shouldn't have said that. I overspoke, and that's too harsh. Okay, that's fact one. Fact two. This is not something limited just to the Jewish people. Luther spoke that way about everyone he disagreed with. It's not like Luther was deliberately targeting the Jews and harassing them. That's not what Luther was on about. He wasn't picking on the Jews. He said the same things about the Muslims, he said the same things about the Catholics, he said the same things about the Anabaptists, the enthusiasts, the Zwinglians, the Bucer. Luther spoke that way about everyone. That's just Luther. Fact 3. Luther is not an anti-Semite, he's anti-Jewish. Or to be exact, he's anti-Judaic. Because Luther is not attacking ethnic or racial Jews. When Luther uses the word Jew, he's particularly having in mind the religion of Judaism. This is a religious issue, not an ethnic or racial issue. No, Luther is not anti-Semitic because he's not picking on Semitic peoples. He's not attacking, you know, Israelis or Israelites or people who are ethnically Jewish. If you were ethnically Jewish, but you were a believing Christian, Luther has no problem with you. If you were a Lutheran, but you had Jewish blood, Luther would have thought you were his best mate. When Luther is bad-mouthing the Jews, he's not talking about the race Jews. He's talking about the religion, rabbinic Judaism. He's attacking that. That's what Luther is attacking. Point 4. As I mentioned earlier, one thing that needs to be kept in mind, and Luther points this out in his letter against the Sabbatarians. When Luther is attacking the Jews, he's not even attacking the Jewish laity. He's particularly attacking their leaders and their teachers. Like in Luther's fifth and final paper, he's directly going after Jewish commentaries. Luther isn't attacking every Jew. Like, first of all, like I said, Luther's not attacking every ethnic Jew. He's only attacking those who hold to the rabbinic Judaic religion. Next, Luther's not even attacking every one of those. He's not going after the laity, he's going after the false teachers. He's going after their rabbis and their teachers and their leaders, and he's going after them for leading the people astray. It's the same reason Luther goes after the Pope and the Catholics. He's not going after every lay person who went to a Roman Catholic church. Luther's going after the priests and the teachers in Roman Catholicism for leading the people astray. And so, basically, in short, no, Luther is not an anti-Semite. Luther said some stuff that he shouldn't have said. But Luther said that not at the race of people, the Jews, but at the religious movement Jews, and even then he's not even attacking everyone in that religious denomination. He's only attacking the leaders and the teachers. And so even if we have a problem with what Luther said, we need to keep in mind that it's directed at the teachers in the rabbinic Jewish faith. And Luther attacks them for teaching contrary to the Word of God, for teaching contrary to the Bible, for rejecting the Messiah, denying the Trinity. Like, Luther is attacking these on religious grounds. And so it is unfair to say Luther is an anti-Semite. Like, Luther attacks the Turks, as he calls them. It's what he calls the Muslims. Luther goes after them. But nobody's saying Luther is anti-Arab, because he wasn't attacking the Arabic people or the Turkic peoples. He was attacking the Islamic religion. Luther goes on about how bad Rome is, but wouldn't say Luther is anti-Italian, that Luther hates Italians. No, Luther hated the Roman Catholic denomination. Like, Luther is attacking the religion. He's attacking these false faiths that teach contrary to the Word of God. He's not attacking the people. He's not attacking the races and the ethnicities that make up those people. Luther is no more anti-Semitic than he is anti-Italian. And so I hope that answers this question. And I hope many people can come to see that Luther's words against the Jews were not anti-Semitism. They were religiously motivated. Doesn't justify what he said. Doesn't mean what he said was right or appropriate or fitting for his office as a priest. But it's unfair to say he's a Semite because of what he said. Because his words were not racially based. They were religiously based. And if anybody who was an ethnic, racial Jew who converted to Christianity, Luther would have had no problem with them. And we can see that in Luther's fifth and final writing, where he refers to the prophets and the apostles as the true Israel, the true Jews, the true people of God, those who are God's people not by race but by faith. Luther doesn't care about race. Luther never cared about race. Luther's issue was always faith. And so I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.